When military historians examine the Battle of Kursk, their attention typically gravitates toward the armored clashes that unfolded across the rolling steppe of central Russia during the summer of 1943. Tank commanders, mechanized warfare, and the grinding attrition of steel against steel dominate the narrative. Yet above the smoke and thunder of the largest tank engagement in human history, another battle was being fought with equal ferocity and perhaps greater long-term consequence. The skies over Kursk became an aerial slaughterhouse where hundreds of aircraft converged in massed formations, where fighter pilots dueled at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour, where bombers disintegrated under anti-aircraft fire, and where the fate of entire armies hung on the outcome of dogfights lasting mere seconds. The air war over Kursk represented something unprecedented in the history of aerial combat. Never before had so many aircraft been concentrated over such a relatively confined battlefield. Never before had two major air forces committed their strength so completely to a single engagement. What unfolded in the skies above the Kursk salient during July 1943 would determine not only the immediate tactical situation on the ground, but would mark a fundamental shift in the balance of air power on the Eastern Front. For the Luftwaffe, Kursk represented the last moment when German air superiority seemed achievable. For the Soviet Air Force, it marked the beginning of an ascendancy that would carry them all the way to Berlin. The spring of 1943 found the Luftwaffe still capable of delivering devastating blows. During the Third Battle of Kharkov in March, German air power had proven indispensable to Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's counter-offensive. Soviet intelligence reports from this period captured the visceral impact of German air superiority with stark clarity. One report noted that the enemy was attacking heavily with aircraft, emphasizing the effective coordination between Luftwaffe bombers and ground forces. Another Soviet assessment observed that enemy tank movements were being executed under constant air cover, illustrating how deeply integrated the Luftwaffe had become with Wehrmacht tactical doctrine. This was not merely air support in the conventional sense. The Luftwaffe functioned as an airborne artillery arm, capable of delivering precision strikes against Soviet strongpoints, disrupting communications, and creating conditions for rapid armored advances. The success at Kharkov convinced the German High Command that air superiority remained achievable in the east, despite mounting pressures elsewhere. As planning intensified for Operation Citadel, the proposed offensive aimed at eliminating the Kursk salient, the Luftwaffe's role became central to German calculations. The operation envisioned a classic double envelopment, with Army Group South driving northward from the Belgorod area, while Army Group Center pushed southward from the Ural region. If successful, this pincer movement would trap hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops and potentially restore German initiative along the entire Eastern Front. The Luftwaffe would need to protect these advancing columns, suppress Soviet artillery, destroy Soviet armor reserves, and most critically, prevent the Soviet Air Force from interfering with German ground operations. Yet beneath the surface confidence, the Luftwaffe faced challenges that would prove insurmountable. The force that had terrorized Europe in 1940 and dominated the skies over Russia during the opening phases of Barbarossa was no longer the same instrument. Attrition had taken an irreversible toll. Experienced pilots who had survived 2 years of brutal combat were exhausted. Aircraft that had seemed modern in 1941 were now technologically matched or surpassed by improved Soviet designs. Most critically, German aircraft production was failing to keep pace with losses, while Soviet factories were churning out aircraft in quantities that German planners had not thought possible. The fighter force upon which Luftwaffe commanders would rely at Kursk consisted primarily of two types. The Messerschmitt Bf 109G represented the latest iteration of a design that had entered service before the war began. Though still a capable fighter, the 109G suffered from the accumulated compromises of continuous development. It was heavier than earlier variants, its handling characteristics had degraded, and its performance envelope was narrower. The Focke-Wulf FW190, introduced to combat in 1941, offered superior firepower and better handling at lower altitudes, but it too was being pushed to its operational limits. Both aircraft were approximately equal in performance to the latest Soviet fighters, the Yakovlev Yak-9 and Lavochkin Lafiv, with German types holding a slight edge in certain flight regimes while Soviet aircraft excelled in others. The planned successor to the Bf 109, the Messerschmitt Me 209, had been abandoned after development proved problematic. German hopes now rested on the Me 262 jet fighter, a revolutionary design that promised performance far exceeding any contemporary aircraft. But as July 1943 approached, the Me 262 existed only in prototype form. Production remained months away, and operational deployment would not occur until 1944. At Kursk, German fighter pilots would fly into battle in aircraft that were fundamentally similar to those they had flown 2 years earlier, facing an enemy whose numerical strength had grown exponentially. The disparity in numbers was stark and would prove decisive. For Operation Citadel, the Luftwaffe assembled approximately 1,700 aircraft. In the northern sector, supporting General Walter Model's 9th Army, was Luftflotte 6's 1st Air Division under Major General Paul Deichmann, comprising roughly 730 aircraft stationed around airfields near Orel. In the southern sector, supporting General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf, was Luftflotte 4 under the command of General Otto Desloch, with 1,100 aircraft distributed across airfields around Kharkov and Belgorod. Against this force, the Soviet High Command had concentrated nearly 3,000 aircraft from multiple air armies. The Soviet 16th Air Army under General Sergei Rudenko and the 2nd Air Army under General Konstantin Vershinin would operate over the southern and northern sectors respectively, with additional support from the 17th Air Army under General Fyodor Sudet on the southwestern flank. Coordinating this massive aerial armada was Air Marshal Alexander Novikov, the Red Air Force commander, working under the strategic direction of Marshal Georgy Zhukov. The Soviets held a 2-to-1 advantage in fighters and an even greater superiority in ground attack aircraft. Only in day bombers did the Luftwaffe maintain numerical superiority, and even this advantage was of limited value given the nature of the coming battle. Yet numbers alone do not tell the complete story. The qualitative gap between German and Soviet pilots remained enormous. Many German fighter pilots heading into Kursk had been flying combat missions since 1939 or 1940. They had fought over France, Britain, the Mediterranean, and Russia. They understood energy management, deflection shooting, mutual support tactics, and the 100 small decisions that separated survival from death in aerial combat. Their situational awareness had been honed through hundreds of missions. They knew instinctively when to press an attack and when to break away, how to use the sun and clouds, how to conserve ammunition and fuel. Soviet pilot training, by contrast, remained inadequate despite improvements implemented following the disasters of 1941 and 1942. A new tactical training program introduced in January 1943 had begun teaching fighter pilots proper combat maneuvers and attack techniques, but most Soviet aviators still entered combat with minimal flight hours and almost no gunnery training. The typical Soviet fighter pilot arriving at the front in mid-1943 had logged perhaps 30 hours of flight time, most of it basic flying rather than combat training. Gunnery practice was minimal due to ammunition shortages. Tactical formation flying was barely practiced. Many Soviet pilots had never fired their guns before entering combat. The result was predictable. Soviet losses would be horrific, but the Soviet system could absorb these losses. Fresh pilots arrived continuously from training schools. Aircraft production never faltered. The question was not whether the Soviet Air Force could match German pilot skill, but whether German pilot skill mattered when facing such overwhelming numerical superiority. The Luftwaffe units assembled for Citadel included some of the most experienced and decorated fighter pilots in the world. Jagdgeschwader 52, operating in the southern sector, fielded multiple pilots with over 100 victories. Hauptmann Joachim Kirschner, commanding one of JG-52's squadrons, had already been credited with 148 aerial victories before Kursk began. On the first day of combat, he would add 2 more, bringing his total to 150. Other aces scattered throughout the Luftwaffe order of battle carried similar tallies. These were not men flying combat missions. These were men who had been flying combat missions continuously for years, who had survived through a combination of skill, aggression, and luck that was running progressively thinner. The strategic situation confronting German commanders as July approached was deteriorating rapidly. German intelligence was aware that the Soviets expected the offensive. Reconnaissance had detected extensive Soviet defensive preparations throughout the Kursk salient. Multiple defensive belts had been constructed, studded with anti-tank guns, minefields, and artillery positions. Soviet commanders had created defense in depth on a scale that Wehrmacht forces had never previously encountered. The element of surprise, which had been central to German planning, no longer existed. Hitler had repeatedly delayed the offensive, waiting for new Panther tanks to arrive at the front, waiting for additional Tiger tanks, waiting for better conditions. Each delay gave the Soviets more time to prepare. By late June, German field commanders understood they would be attacking prepared defenses with an enemy fully expecting their assault. Soviet intelligence collection had been remarkably effective. Through multiple channels, including the Lucy spy ring operating in Switzerland and the British decryption efforts at Bletchley Park, Stalin received detailed information about German plans, unit dispositions, and even the intended date and time of the offensive. Soviet commanders knew not only that the attack was coming, but where it would fall and with what forces. This intelligence windfall allowed for optimal defensive positioning and, more relevant to the air war, enabled the Soviet Air Force to plan a devastating, preemptive strike. The concept was audacious. Rather than waiting for the Luftwaffe to strike first, Soviet air commanders would launch their own attack against German airfields in the hours immediately before the ground offensive began. If successful, this strike would catch the Luftwaffe on the ground, destroying bombers and fighters before they could take off, crippling German air support before the first German tank crossed the start line. The planning for this operation fell to Generals Rudenko, Vershinin, and Sudet, coordinating their air armies to deliver maximum weight against the concentrated German airfields around Belgorod, Kharkov, and Orel. Aerial reconnaissance had identified the primary Luftwaffe bases. The airfield at Mikoyanovka, 17 miles south of Belgorod, served as the headquarters of 8th Flieger Corps under General Hans Seidemann and hosted significant numbers of bombers and ground attack aircraft. Other major bases at Pomerki, Sokolniki, Osnova, and Rogan held up to 150 aircraft each. Intelligence reports noted that these airfields were crammed with aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, presenting ideal targets. Even more valuable to potential attackers, these bases held enormous stockpiles of ordnance. Seidemann's forces had accumulated enough bombs and ammunition for 10 full mission cycles. In the northern sector, Deichmann's units possessed sufficient munitions for 15 days of intensive operations. A successful strike against these concentrated, heavily laden airfields could potentially eliminate the Luftwaffe's ability to support the ground offensive before that offensive even began. The night of July 4th and the early morning hours of July 5th, 1943, found both air forces preparing for the coming storm. At German airfields throughout the Belgorod and Orel regions, ground crews performed final checks on aircraft. Bomb and ammunition loads were prepared, fuel tanks were topped off, pilots attended briefings where the day's missions were outlined. The operational plan called for bombers to take off first, circle above their bases to form up into their assigned formations, then proceed toward their targets once fighter escorts had joined them. This procedure was standard, designed to ensure that slower bombers did not fly unescorted into enemy airspace where they would be vulnerable to Soviet fighters. At Soviet airfields, a different kind of preparation was underway. Fighter regiments and ground attack squadrons were being briefed on the preemptive strike. The plan called for 417 aircraft to launch simultaneously, arriving over German airfields at dawn. The attacking force would consist of 285 fighters providing escort and top cover, with 132 Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft delivering the actual strikes. The Il-2, known to Soviet pilots as the flying tank due to its armored cockpit, carried bombs, rockets, and cannons specifically designed for attacking ground targets. German pilots, who had learned to respect the Il-2's durability, called it the Black Death, or referred to the aircraft as concrete bombers due to their resistance to fighter attacks. The Soviet plan depended entirely on surprise. If the Luftwaffe detected the approaching strike and scrambled fighters to intercept, the slow, heavily laden Il-2s would be slaughtered. Soviet fighter escorts would need to protect the ground attack aircraft while simultaneously dealing with German interceptors and anti-aircraft fire. The entire operation carried enormous risk, but if successful, it could deliver a knockout blow before the battle properly began. Shortly after 2 in the morning on July 5th, Soviet air regiments began receiving their final orders. Engines coughed to life in the darkness. Mechanics performed last-minute checks by flashlight. Pilots climbed into cockpits, adjusted their straps, tested their controls. The tension was palpable. Every man involved understood the stakes. Within the hour, hundreds of Soviet aircraft would be airborne, flying west toward German airfields, hoping to arrive undetected, hoping to find the Luftwaffe still on the ground. But the Luftwaffe was not asleep. German radio intelligence units monitoring Soviet communications detected an unusual surge in radio traffic around the Kursk salient during the early morning hours. The pattern was unmistakable. Something significant was happening within Soviet air units. Initially, German radar operators estimated approximately 100 aircraft were airborne and heading toward German positions. Within minutes, this estimate was revised upward. 200 aircraft, then 300, then over 400. The scale of the incoming raid became horrifyingly clear. This was not a probing attack or a harassment mission. An entire Soviet air army was inbound, heading directly toward the concentrated German airfields around Belgorod. The radar station monitoring this development immediately contacted Mikoyanovka, where the 8th Fliegerkorps headquarters was located. The duty officer grasped the situation instantly and rushed to find General Seidemann and General Hans Detlef Herhut von Roden, the Luftwaffe Chief of Staff, who was visiting the front. Both generals turned pale as the report was delivered. Their carefully planned operation was about to be disrupted catastrophically. The bombers, heavy with fuel and ordnance, were preparing to take off. If they attempted to launch now, they would climb directly into the path of incoming Soviet fighters. If they remained on the ground, they would be destroyed where they sat. Either way, the carefully orchestrated opening of Citadel was collapsing before it had begun. A decision was made within seconds. Bomber takeoffs were cancelled immediately. Runners sprinted across the airfield, signaling ground crews with thumbs-up gestures to indicate the change in orders. Fighter squadrons were given priority. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, already at readiness, began taxiing immediately toward the runways. Pilots in fighter cockpits, who had been waiting for the bombers to launch first, suddenly found themselves racing to get airborne. The entire operational sequence was being reversed in real time, with German fighters now scrambling to intercept the Soviet strike force before it could reach the airfields. At other Luftwaffe bases throughout the region, the same desperate improvisation was unfolding. At Kharkov, at Pomerki, at the fields around Orel, fighters were being rushed into the air while bombers and ground attack aircraft remained parked and vulnerable. The question facing every German commander was identical and terrifying. Would they get enough fighters airborne in time, or was Stalin about to obliterate the Luftwaffe's offensive capability before Operation Citadel could begin? German pilots, jolted from their pre-mission routine into emergency scramble, reacted with the professionalism born of years of combat experience. Fighters accelerated down runways, lifted off, and immediately turned toward the east, where the Soviet formations were approaching. In the pre-dawn darkness, with visibility still limited, they climbed to intercept altitude, seeking the enemy bombers and fighters that radar had detected. The Luftwaffe's 3rd and 52nd Fighter Groups from JG-52 and other units were vectored toward the incoming threat. Within minutes, German fighters were in position, waiting in the growing light for the Soviet formations to appear. The Soviet strike force pressed westward, confident that surprise remained intact. Fighter pilots scanned the horizon, watching for the telltale shapes of German airfields. Ground attack pilots checked their bomb loads one final time, preparing for the attack run. The entire formation maintained radio silence, hoping to avoid detection. Soviet commanders, monitoring the operation from their headquarters, believed the plan was proceeding perfectly. The Germans would be caught napping, their aircraft destroyed on the ground, their offensive support eliminated before the first shot of the ground battle. Then, emerging from the haze of early morning, German fighters struck. The interception was sudden and devastating. Soviet pilots who had expected clear skies to their target suddenly found themselves engaged by swarms of German fighters attacking from multiple directions. The carefully planned Soviet formation began to disintegrate immediately as fighters scattered to deal with the German attack. Il-2 Sturmovix, heavy with bombs and lacking fighter protection, became targets of opportunity. German pilots, recognizing the vulnerability of the ground attack aircraft, pressed their attacks with lethal efficiency. Across the skies between Belgorod and Kharkov, the most intense aerial engagement of the war to that point erupted with shocking violence. Soviet fighters attempted to screen the Il-2s while simultaneously defending themselves. German fighters focused on destroying as many Soviet aircraft as possible before they could reach the airfields. Dogfights broke out at multiple altitudes. Aircraft dove, climbed, rolled, and burned. The sky filled with tracers, smoke trails, and falling debris. Pilots who had expected a straightforward bombing mission found themselves fighting for their lives against an enemy who was prepared, alert, and thoroughly experienced. The tactical disadvantage facing Soviet pilots became immediately apparent. Soviet fighter doctrine emphasized rigid formations and centralized control, with little initiative granted to individual pilots. When the carefully planned attack dissolved into chaos, Soviet pilots struggled to adapt. German pilots, trained in fluid, aggressive tactics based on two-ship elements with mutual support, exploited this rigidity ruthlessly. Wherever Soviet formations appeared, German fighters tore into them, scattering escorts and isolating ground attack aircraft. The Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, flown by men with hundreds of combat missions, demonstrated why experience mattered in aerial combat. One Soviet Il-2 pilot, Senior Lieutenant Simonov, described his experience approaching the target. As the formation neared Belgorod, he could see anti-aircraft fire beginning to fill the sky. He held his course, searching for enemy aircraft on the ground. To his shock, he saw German fighters taking off rather than sitting parked and vulnerable. The realization that surprise had been lost came too late. Before he could begin his attack, his Sturmovik was hit multiple times by flak. Control became difficult. He abandoned the mission and turned back towards Soviet lines, nursing his damaged aircraft eastward. He managed to crash land behind Soviet positions, surviving but accomplishing nothing. Simonov's experience was replicated hundreds of times that morning. Soviet aircraft that managed to penetrate the fighter screen encountered intense anti-aircraft fire from German positions that had been alerted and were fully prepared. Those Il-2s that pressed their attacks dropped their bombs but achieved minimal damage. Most never reached their targets at all, driven away by fighters or flak, forced to jettison their ordnance and flee. The formations that had taken off with such confidence returned in tatters, having sustained catastrophic losses while accomplishing virtually nothing. The air battle lasted nearly 2 hours. By the time the surviving Soviet aircraft disengaged and retreated eastward, the sky over Belgorod and Kharkov was littered with wreckage. German pilots claimed over 120 Soviet aircraft destroyed. Soviet records, which remain partially classified, admit to losses exceeding 160 pilots killed or missing, including 111 junior lieutenants, the lowest officer rank typically held by recent flying school graduates. Another 22 sergeants were also lost, representing pilots who had received minimal training before being thrust into combat. The human cost of this failed strike was staggering, but from the Soviet perspective, the loss of inexperienced pilots was acceptable. Stalin's military machine operated on the principle of numerical superiority regardless of cost. Pilots could be replaced. Aircraft could be manufactured. The ruthless calculus of Soviet strategy meant that these young men, whose training had been inadequate and whose chances of survival had been minimal, were expendable resources to be traded for time and advantage. For the Luftwaffe, the successful defense of their airfields appeared to be a complete victory. General Seidemann could barely believe the outcome. Less than an hour earlier, his bombers had been moments from destruction. Now, through quick reaction and pilot skill, the threat had been eliminated. German losses were remarkably light, officially reported as 26 aircraft lost on July 5th, though subsequent analysis reveals the actual figure was closer to 55 aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair, including 23 fighters. More critically, 20 German pilots had been killed or captured, including 12 fighter pilots whose experience was irreplaceable. The immediate consequence of the failed Soviet strike was complete Luftwaffe air superiority over the southern sector of the battlefield for the opening phase of Operation Citadel. With Soviet fighter strength temporarily shattered and ground attack regiments reeling from massive losses, German bombers and ground attack aircraft could operate with relative impunity during the critical first hours of the ground offensive. At approximately 4:30 a.m., as dawn broke fully over the steppe, German bombers began their assault on Soviet defensive positions. Junkers Ju-87 Stukas, Junkers Ju-88 medium bombers, Heinkel He 100s-11s, and Do-17s flew mission after mission against Soviet strongpoints, artillery positions, and troop concentrations. The ground offensive, which had been scheduled to begin at 3 a.m., kicked off slightly behind schedule, but with the full weight of Luftwaffe support. In the southern sector, the SS Panzer Corps, comprising the elite Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, advanced behind a rolling artillery barrage supplemented by continuous airstrikes. German ground attack aircraft, particularly the Henschel H's 129 tank busters, equipped with 30mm cannons, and the Ju-87G Stukas, mounting 37mm anti-tank guns, roamed the battlefield seeking Soviet armor. One pilot, Hauptmann Hans-Ulrich Rudel, flying his personal Ju-87G, claimed 12 Soviet tanks destroyed on the first day of battle, using his twin 37mm guns with devastating effect. Rudel, who would become the most decorated German serviceman of the war, flew so low during his attacks that his aircraft was repeatedly scorched by the explosions of the tanks he destroyed. His success, however, was an outlier. The Luftwaffe possessed far too few dedicated tank-busting aircraft to make a strategic difference against the overwhelming numbers of Soviet armor deployed in the salient. Only 8 Ju-87Gs and 16 H-129 equipped with 37mm guns were available for Citadel. Against thousands of Soviet tanks, this was wholly inadequate. The Luftwaffe flew over 3,300 sorties on July 5th, with nearly 2,000 of these in the southern sector supporting the SS Panzer Corps and 4th Panzer Army. The intensity of operations was unprecedented. Pilots flew multiple missions, landed to refuel and rearm, then immediately returned to the battle. Fatigue began accumulating from the first day. Mechanics worked through the daylight hours performing repairs and maintenance, preparing aircraft for the next day's operations. The tempo could not be sustained indefinitely, but for the moment German air power was dominant and effective. Yet even as the Luftwaffe delivered devastating attacks against Soviet positions, the limits of air power were becoming apparent. Despite intensive bombing and strafing, Soviet defenses held. German ground forces, encountering defense in depth that exceeded all previous experience, found their advance slowing almost immediately. The multiple defensive belts, the density of anti-tank guns, the minefields, and the sheer depth of Soviet positions absorbed the German assault. By evening, on July 5th, the SS Panzer Corps had penetrated 2 of 3 main Soviet defensive lines in some sectors, but progress was measured in single kilometers rather than the breakthrough that German planners had anticipated. In the northern sector, where General Model's 9th Army was attacking toward the south, results were even more disappointing. The Luftwaffe's 1st Air Division, supporting Model's forces, faced more effective Soviet air opposition. Soviet fighters from the 16th Air Army contested German air superiority with greater success than their counterparts in the south. By July 7th, German corps commanders in the north were reporting heavy Soviet air attacks, indicating that the Luftwaffe had lost air superiority in that sector within 48 hours of the offensive's start. The strain on Luftwaffe resources was immediate and severe. By the evening of July 5th, General Hermann Hoth, commanding 4th Panzer Army in the southern sector, was requesting increased air support for his 48th Panzer Corps, which was struggling against unexpectedly strong Soviet resistance. The problem was not willingness but capacity. The Luftwaffe simply did not possess enough aircraft to provide continuous close air support to all attacking units simultaneously. Decisions had to be made about which ground formations would receive air support and which would have to manage without it. This prioritization meant that some German units advanced with extensive air cover, while others fought under conditions of near parity or even Soviet air superiority. The second day of the offensive, July 6th, saw continued intense air operations, but with diminishing returns. Soviet resistance was stiffening everywhere. German casualties were mounting faster than anticipated. The speed of advance was well below what operational plans had projected. Worse, the Soviet Air Force, despite the catastrophic losses on July 5th, was already returning to combat effectiveness. Fresh aircraft and pilots were flowing to the front from reserve airfields. Soviet ground attack regiments that had been decimated were reconstituted within 24 hours. The numerical advantage that had seemed temporarily negated was reasserting itself with brutal efficiency. German fighter pilots found themselves outnumbered in every engagement. Luftwaffe ace Hans Grünberg, flying from a forward airfield, described being urgently recalled to defend his base against attacking Soviet Iltus. He claimed 4 Sturmovix shot down during this defensive action, but the attacks continued relentlessly. Later that same day, Grünberg observed Soviet ground attack aircraft swarming over German tank columns, dropping bombs and firing rockets despite intense anti-aircraft fire and repeated fighter interceptions. The message was clear. No matter how many Soviet aircraft were destroyed, more appeared to replace them. By July 7th, the operational limitations facing the Luftwaffe were becoming undeniable. In the northern sector, only 481 attack sorties were flown that day, barely a third of the number flown on July 5th. Pilot exhaustion was acute. Aircraft were requiring longer turnaround times for maintenance. Spare parts were becoming scarce. In desperation, reconnaissance aircraft were being pressed into service as makeshift bombers, carrying improvised bomb loads and flying attack missions for which they were never designed. This expedient accounted for 110 sorties on July 7th alone, highlighting how desperately German commanders needed additional strike capacity. The experience of bomber pilot Oberleutnant Martin Willemer illustrated the conditions under which Luftwaffe crews were operating. Already sleep-deprived from days of continuous missions, Willemer described flying in terrible weather conditions, struggling to navigate and find targets. On his third mission of July 8th, he became lost, failed to locate his assigned target, and instead bombed what appeared to be a Soviet anti-aircraft battery simply because it was shooting at him. He barely made it back to base, landing with minimal fuel, his crew exhausted and his aircraft damaged by flak. This was not precision air support, this was survival. Fighter pilots faced similar exhaustion compounded by constant combat. Soviet ace Ivan Kozhedub, who would end the war as the highest-scoring Allied fighter pilot with 62 victories, recalled routinely flying 3 to 4 sorties per day during the height of the Kursk fighting. For outnumbered German fighter pilots, the sortie rate was even higher. Some German pilots flew 5 or 6 missions daily, taking off, engaging Soviet aircraft, landing to refuel and rearm, then immediately returning to combat. The cumulative fatigue degraded performance, slowed reaction times, and increased the risk of fatal errors. On July 9th, a series of incidents demonstrated how the relentless pace was breaking down Luftwaffe effectiveness. Lieutenant Edmund Rossmann, an ace with 93 victories, led a weather reconnaissance mission over the front. During confused combat in heavy clouds, one pilot was shot down and killed. Feldwebel Heribert Lohberg, another ace with 25 victories, had his Messerschmitt damaged and was forced to make an emergency landing. Rossmann landed nearby to rescue Lohberg, believing they were about 12 miles west of their base at Ugrim. They were actually over 20 miles west and less than a mile from a Soviet communications battalion. Soviet soldiers rushed toward the landed German aircraft, shooting Lohberg dead and knocking Rossmann unconscious with a rifle butt. The Soviets captured both Messerschmitt 109s. Lohberg's aircraft was tested by Soviet pilots, while Rossmann's brand-new Mi-109 G6 was destroyed by Soviet ace captain Ivan Sisakov when he attempted to take it off and crashed. Rossmann survived 6 years in Soviet captivity, returning to Germany only in 1949. These losses, while individually tragic, represented a pattern of attrition that the Luftwaffe could not sustain. Every experienced pilot lost represented years of training and combat knowledge that could never be fully replaced. Germany's pilot training program, already strained by the demands of multi-front warfare, could not produce pilots of equivalent quality in sufficient numbers. The Luftwaffe was consuming its seed corn, trading irreplaceable veterans for temporary tactical advantage. By July 10th, the situation had deteriorated to the point that difficult decisions could no longer be avoided. All Henschel H's 129 tank-busting units were ordered withdrawn from the Kursk sector and redeployed to the Ural area to the north, where a massive Soviet counter-offensive was developing. This left only Hans-Ulrich Rudel's personal Ju-87G as dedicated anti-tank air support in the southern sector. The decision effectively acknowledged that the German offensive had failed. With insufficient forces to support both pincers of the planned envelopment, and with no reserves available, victory at Kursk was impossible. Yet fighting continued. On July 12th, the largest single day of tank combat occurred near Prokhorovka, where the 2nd SS Panzer Corps engaged multiple Soviet tank armies in a massive swirling melee. The Luftwaffe provided what support it could, but air power proved largely irrelevant in a battle where hundreds of tanks fought at point-blank range amid smoke, dust, and chaos. The tactical details of Prokhorovka remain controversial, but the strategic outcome was clear. The German offensive had been stopped. Soviet defenses, despite horrific losses, had held. The initiative was passing to the Red Army. That same day, July 12th, the Soviets launched Operation Kutuzov, a major counter-offensive against the Oral salient north of Kursk. This new threat required immediate German response. Units that had been committed to Citadel were now needed to prevent a catastrophic breakthrough in Army Group Center's rear area. The Luftwaffe, already overstretched, was forced to shift aircraft northward to support defensive operations around Oral. Air support for the still engaged forces at Kursk diminished rapidly. The broader strategic situation was collapsing around Germany. On July 10th, Anglo-American forces had landed in Sicily, opening a new front in the Mediterranean and forcing Hitler to consider withdrawing forces from the Eastern Front to defend Italy. The Allies' entry into the European continent, even in the south, represented a fundamental shift in Germany's strategic position. German reserves, which were desperately needed in Russia, would now be required in multiple theatres simultaneously. The prospect of concentrating force at a decisive point, which had been the foundation of German military success since 1939, was no longer possible. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding Soviet forces in the northern sector of the Kursk salient, recognized immediately what the Allied landing meant. He issued a message to his troops that German intelligence intercepted and reported to German commanders. The message read that the Allies had landed on Sicily and that victory was certain if Soviet forces held their positions. Rokossovsky was correct. The strategic situation had shifted irrevocably against Germany. Even if Citadel had somehow achieved tactical success, which by mid-July was clearly impossible, the broader war was now unwinnable for Germany. Hitler cancelled Operation Citadel on July 13th, 8 days after it had begun. German forces were ordered to assume defensive positions. The dream of encircling and destroying Soviet forces in the Kursk salient died in the minefields, anti-tank ditches, and killing grounds that Soviet engineers had prepared with such methodical care. The Luftwaffe's role in this failure was complex. Tactically, German air power had been effective, delivering devastating strikes and maintaining air superiority in key sectors for extended periods. German pilots had achieved impressive kill ratios, destroying Soviet aircraft in far greater numbers than they lost. Yet strategically, none of this mattered. Air superiority had not translated into ground success. Soviet defenses had absorbed everything the Luftwaffe could deliver and remained intact. The final accounting of the air war at Kursk reveals the futility of tactical success without strategic victory. The Luftwaffe flew approximately 24,000 sorties during the battle, losing roughly 240 aircraft. Soviet air forces flew approximately 30,000 sorties and lost an estimated 1,200 aircraft. The kill ratio heavily favored the Germans. Individual German pilots continued to achieve remarkable success, yet the Soviet Air Force emerged from Kursk stronger, not weaker. Production replaced losses within weeks. New pilots, however inadequately trained, filled vacant cockpits. The numerical advantage that the Soviets possessed at the battle start was even greater at its conclusion. For the Luftwaffe, Kursk represented a turning point from which recovery proved impossible. The loss of 240 aircraft might seem sustainable, but these were frontline combat aircraft, many of them fighters, lost at a time when German industry was struggling to maintain production rates. More critically, the pilot losses, while numerically small compared to Soviet casualties, represented veterans whose experience could not be replaced. Every ace killed or captured at Kursk represented thousands of hours of combat experience, tactical knowledge, and training value that was lost permanently. The Luftwaffe's fighter force in particular was being consumed faster than it could be regenerated. Equally significant was the psychological impact. German pilots had entered Kursk confident in their superiority over Soviet opponents. They had achieved remarkable tactical successes, winning virtually every engagement on terms favorable to German assessment criteria, yet they had lost the battle, The realization that tactical air superiority was insufficient against an enemy who could absorb unlimited losses and return indefinitely with fresh forces was profoundly demoralizing. The Luftwaffe had won the air battle but lost the war. The shifting of Luftwaffe resources to other fronts accelerated after Kursk. Anglo-American bombing of Germany intensified dramatically during late 1943. The combined bomber offensive required the recall of fighter units from the Eastern Front to defend the Reich. By autumn 1943, the majority of Germany's single-engine fighter force was committed to home defense, leaving the Eastern Front progressively denuded of air cover. The Red Air Force, emboldened by success at Kursk and strengthened by continuous reinforcement, began achieving consistent air superiority over most sectors of the front. German ground forces, which had operated since 1941 with the confidence that the Luftwaffe would protect them from air attack, now experienced what Soviet forces had endured earlier in the war: helplessness under enemy air superiority. The technological balance also shifted permanently after Kursk. Soviet aircraft design continued improving, with new variants of the Yak-9 and La-5 entering service that were fully competitive with German types. Soviet pilot training gradually improved, not to German standards but sufficiently to narrow the qualitative gap. Meanwhile, the Me-262 jet fighter, which might have restored German air superiority had it entered service in quantity during 1943, was delayed by technical problems, production difficulties, and Hitler's insistence that it be developed as a bomber rather than a pure fighter. By the time the Me-262 finally reached operational units in mid-1944, the Luftwaffe lacked the fuel, pilots, and infrastructure to employ it effectively. The story of the air war over Kursk is ultimately a story of how tactical excellence proved insufficient against strategic disadvantage. German pilots were better trained, more experienced, and arguably flying slightly superior aircraft. They achieved remarkable kill ratios and demonstrated extraordinary skill and courage. Yet none of this compensated for the fundamental reality that Germany lacked the industrial capacity, the manpower reserves, and the strategic depth to sustain a war of attrition against the Soviet Union, while simultaneously fighting Britain and America. The Luftwaffe at Kursk was a highly capable force operating within constraints that made victory impossible. For the young Soviet pilots who died in such numbers over Kursk, their sacrifice was not in vain from a strategic perspective, though this provided no comfort to the men themselves or their families. Soviet losses, horrific as they were sustainable within the broader framework of Soviet strategy. Every German aircraft destroyed, every mission flown by exhausted Luftwaffe pilots, every hour of combat consumed German resources that could not be replaced. The Soviet Air Force was trading space, time, and lives for the ultimate certainty that Germany would exhaust itself. The aerial engagements over Kursk demonstrated fundamental truths about modern industrial warfare. Air superiority is necessary, but not sufficient for victory. Pilot quality matters, but can be overcome by numerical superiority if the disparity is large enough. Tactical success is meaningless without strategic context. The Germans learned these lessons at catastrophic cost. The Soviets, who had paid an even higher cost earlier in the war, now possessed both the resources and the knowledge to exploit Germany's weaknesses. When historians examine the Battle of Kursk, they focus on tank combat because the visual drama of armored warfare is compelling, and the tactical details are fascinating. But the battle in the skies, less visible and less documented, was equally important and perhaps more consequential. The Luftwaffe's inability to prevent Soviet recovery from the disasters of July 5th, the relentless attrition of German pilot experience, the growing disparity in numbers, and the fundamental shift in air superiority all contributed decisively to the battle's outcome and to the broader trajectory of the Eastern Front. The summer sky over the Kursk salient in July 1943 witnessed one of history's largest and most brutal aerial battles. Thousands of aircraft fought in conditions of extraordinary intensity over a battlefield where ground combat was equally savage. Pilots on both sides displayed courage, skill, and determination. They fought until their fuel and ammunition were exhausted, then landed, rearmed, and fought again. They did this day after day until exhaustion became almost unbearable. Many did not return. Their aircraft fell burning from the sky or disintegrated under enemy fire, and they were gone. For the men who survived, the memories of those desperate encounters in the sky above Kursk remained vivid for the rest of their lives. The sound of engines screaming under full power, the rattle of cannon fire, the sight of comrades spiraling downward, trailing smoke, the terror and exhilaration of combat at 400 miles per hour. These were the realities of the air war that determined the fate of armies fighting below. Kursk marked the moment when the Luftwaffe ceased to be a decisive factor in the East. The air force that had terrorized Europe and dominated the skies over Russia for 2 years was broken not in a single catastrophic defeat, but through continuous attrition that consumed its strength faster than replacement was possible. The pilots who survived Kursk would fight on with undiminished skill and courage for nearly 2 more years. But they would do so in conditions of increasing disadvantage, outnumbered and eventually outmatched by an enemy whose resources seemed inexhaustible. For the Soviet Air Force, Kursk was validation. The catastrophic losses of 1941 and 1942 had been absorbed. New aircraft were being produced in quantities that German intelligence had dismissed as impossible. Pilot training, while still inadequate by Western standards, was improving. Most importantly, the institutional knowledge of how to fight and win air battles was being accumulated and disseminated. The commanders who had learned hard lessons at Moscow, Stalingrad, and now Kursk would apply that knowledge in the campaigns to come, driving westward toward Berlin with increasing confidence and effectiveness. The sky above Kursk in July 1943 was a killing ground where the future of the Eastern Front was determined not through a single decisive engagement, but through the accumulated weight of thousands of individual combats, sorties, and missions. It was brutal, exhausting, and ultimately decisive. The tanks that clashed below drew the attention of history, but the aircraft that fought above them determined which army would prevail. In that sense, the air battle of Kursk was not a footnote to the larger ground engagement, but rather one of its most important dimensions, deserving of recognition equal to the more famous armoured struggles that have dominated historical memory for 8 decades. And that brings this video to a close. I hope you found it interesting and learned something new. If you enjoyed it, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and I appreciate every one of you who supports the work I do here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, and goodbye for now.